Hi, this is Ron Vellon and welcome to part one of a two-part video tutorial on powerful presentations using this particular presentation model. In the first part we're going to take a high-level view, and in the second part we'll go deeper into the model's components. And we're going to go through it by looking at a couple of levels of it, namely these key ideas here on the right, as well as the significant steps that are detailed here. This part is connected to the PDF for this file that simply explains each of the steps of the model in a very brief way. I'm not going to use this part today, simply that if you have access to the PDF, it will just support you in remembering what each of the stages is for. So let's begin by looking at the overall presentation model and where it came from. The first thing to touch on is to look at what are the main types of presentations. There are some variances, but the three main ones that we see most often are presentations that inform, and this is where we see in business settings, organizational settings, most often we give presentations that might be the result of research we've done or a project we've been working on. Often it's an update. Sometimes it's inviting the group we're presenting to give their input on. Perhaps we want a decision from them. Whatever it is, it's what we call an informative presentation. Another common type of presentation is one in which we are persuading. And this can come in several different forms. It might be a sales presentation, so we're there to sell product or service. It might be there to motivate, and by that it could be enrolling people in a cause, asking people to behave differently or to consider behaving differently. For example, driving less in order to help the environment. It could be encouraging people to consider a different point of view. These are examples of presentations in which we're trying to persuade. And the third type of presentation we can call entertain. And this can come in many different forms. We might be there to host or MC something, maybe a special event, maybe we're there to be the best man or the maid or matron of honor at a wedding. So those are the three main kinds of presentations. There are others, but really for the most part they fall into these three categories. In this tutorial we're focusing on presentations that inform, but the same principles apply to the other two types of presentations. So let's begin with taking a look at the model. This is the core model that I encourage you to study fully and really practice implementing. It can be the key to amazingly successful presentation and one that bores the tears out of your audience. It takes a little more work initially, but as you get to understand how the model works and you practice it more, you'll learn how to bend it, make adjustments, tweak it to different circumstances so you're not always sounding like you're following the exact same steps all the time. But when you understand the basic principles that go into it, you're going to find that your presentation development and writing and delivery will all benefit from this clear structure. So just a shout out to Dale Carnegie and Toastmasters, because the ideas in here, which are not really new at all, have been synthesized from work that these two large organizations have done over the years, and certainly many others that have found that there are certain keys to a great presentation structure. So let's begin with the first thing we need to understand, and this is a principle that we see throughout, and we see that happen in many other situations where people are communicating, and that is to start strong and end strong. Now, why is this so important? In psychology, we have this idea, this concept, which has been well documented, called primacy and recency. More formally, it's the primacy and recency bias. What this basically says is that the things we experience the initial part of, in other words, the first meeting of somebody, is a very impactful moment. And another very impactful moment is the last impression we have of something. It's just the way our brain works. We go through all kinds of iterations and interpretations within the moments of either meeting someone or watching someone. We see this happen in film, in plays, any public presentation, even musicians. There's that first presentation, that first encounter that really sticks in our mind. And also the last one, so what we call recency, is literally the most recent encounter that our brain pulls away. It doesn't mean that what happens in between is not important. It's just that our mind focuses and remembers more acutely the first thing, primacy, and the last thing, recency. And so this is important to understand when we give a presentation, and you're going to see how this all plays out in a couple of minutes. The next thing we're going to look at relates to the start strong and end strong idea. And these are key aspects, really high level steps if you look at them, that enhance the power of the start that you have and the ending that you have with your presentation. And in addition, if you follow these key steps, your presentation will be more memorable throughout, because they bring up another idea, which is to keep reminding people what you're there to really communicate. So let's look at what these things are. First idea is tell them what you're going to tell them. This relates to how you introduce the main body of your presentation. And this includes the hook, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, the thesis, which is really the main point you're making with your whole presentation, your topic intro statement, in other words, how you introduce the topic, and your subtopic overview. All of this is there to get people aware and on board with what the main body of your presentation is there to do. So tell them what you're going to tell them. The next thing you're going to do is tell them. Now, this may seem like we're starting to be repetitive, but from the audience point of view, if you do it right, it's really reinforcing and supporting their retention and awareness of what you're there to really communicate. What happens with the tell them? This essentially is a section that we refer to as the discussion part of the presentation, where we have your subtopics. This is where you break down all the nuts and bolts of what you're trying to communicate that relate to the main point you're trying to make with your thesis, and help the audience see how they need to connect the dots. Because in an effective presentation, you want to make sure everything is connected to everything else, at least on a very high level, so that your audience can track where you're going. One of the reasons audiences check out and often get bored with a presentation is they can't see where the presentation is going, or what the main point is, or how it relates to them. So I want to make a little note here about an important idea that you need to be aware of and why this presentation structure is so important. WIIFM. What does this mean? What's in it for me? It's a simple idea, but a question we ask as human beings in so many different circumstances. An audience will ask that question to themselves, not exactly in those words, but they may wonder, who is this person if they don't really know you well? They may wonder, does this person have credibility? Is this information going to be interesting? Is it going to be boring? There are a whole series of questions that people ask that kind of boil down to this idea of what's in it for me. So what you're doing by starting strong and using the structure so far that I've outlined, you're showing your audience, come along with me. Come with me, because this is going to be worth your while. And if you can do that with the main part of your intro, the tell them what you're going to tell them section, your audience will give you their attention. When you tell them in a very organized way, in a clear way, and tell great stories, which we'll get to in a moment, your audience will stay with you, because you're going to keep reminding them in different ways of what the main point is of the whole thing through the main subpoints that you make along the way. So what's in it for me? Keep that in mind when you create a presentation. Once you've delivered the main body of the presentation, we get to this part we call tell them what you told them. Now, in case you're wondering if this is again starting to sound repetitive, it isn't in an actual presentation, because you're going to language things in a way that doesn't sound like you're just repeating stuff like you memorized it or you're a robot. You're going to do it in a very discussional way, and what ends up happening is your audience actually appreciates the reminder, because you went back and said, remember that stuff we've been talking about all this time? I'm going to remind you now that the real point of all of it was X, which is the same point I mentioned in the thesis. So in structure, this is where we find the tell them what you told them part. We find it in the summary to begin with. And a summary has some simple ideas in it. And that is, you're trying to remind people of what your subtopics were and what the subthesis was for each subtopic. The subthesis, which is noted here, is the main point for each subtopic. I'm going to show you how the subthesis and thesis and conclusion all map out together in a moment. But that's important to remind people. So we talked about this and this, and we did it for this reason. Then we talked about this and this, we did it for this reason. And what you're doing when you're doing the summary is bringing people together. You're corralling their awareness and reminding them what the main body of the presentation was there to do, because the next thing you're going to tell them is your conclusion. And here's a not surprising newsflash. Your conclusion and your thesis are the same idea. You can think of it as bookending your presentation. The main point you're trying to convey up front tells your audience, this is what you need to focus on. This is where we're going and why. Your conclusion says, this is where we came from and why it's so important. Really important ideas to keep in mind when you're framing a presentation. So once we tell them what you told them, the last step is now to tell them what you want them to do with what you told them. This comes in the form of what we call a recommendation or a call to action right there at the end. What happens is, if you do this presentation well, you're setting them up and putting them on a platform, and your audience, if they're as attentive as you hoped, they're just waiting for you to tell them, now what? What's the now what of this presentation, so that they can take what you have shared with them. You've conveyed a great conclusion, and now they really want to know, what do we do with this? And so if you're giving an informative presentation, let's say a business or other organizational setting, your audience might just want to know, well, our recommendation is that we take this information to a further study, or that we avoid moving into a market such and such because of this situation that's occurring that we've just showed you. A recommendation is important at the end, even if it's simply a recommendation to have another meeting to take it further, or to take it to another level of the organization and share the information, or take it back to the departments and share the information with your employees. Whatever it is, it's a very simple thing that conveys information in a very focused way to the people you're speaking to. The last thing about this, and we'll come back to this in a moment, is you want to make sure that you leave a little gem at the end. Now, what do we mean by a little gem? It's a little afterthought, a little pearl that goes along with it. So if you're giving a presentation in an organization, and let's say, for example, you're speaking to a group of physicians in a hospital, and you're talking about a new form of patient processing that may help them free up their time to spend more time with actual patient care and less time with paperwork. So now what we recommend is that we create little subgroups to talk about how we can implement this in an easeful way in the different departments. That's the recommendation or call to action. The gem might be, this is terrific that we were able to find this system, and we look forward to seeing the stress levels drop with a little bit of effort up front so that it can really find more joy in the work we're doing with our patients. It's just reaffirming that there is a real upside to what we're doing here, and so you can leave an afterthought like that with your audience. And these gems can come in a lot of different forms, literally millions of different things you can say at the end as a gem, depending on what the presentation is, and that really depends on what you're trying to do there. What we're going to do now is go back to hit the specific steps in just a little bit more detail. It'll be brief just to describe them, but we want to talk about all these different steps here within the body of the structure. Remember, we're starting strong to end strong. We're going to tell them what you're going to tell them. You're going to tell them, you're going to tell them what you told them, and then you're going to tell them what you want them to do with what you told them. Very important on a high level that you nail these things down, because in the end, remember, everyone wants to know what's in it for me. A very important idea.